What if everything you were taught about Eden is turned inside out? What if the creature that history has labeled the enemy was never primarily a tempter to be banished, but an agent, whether divine, liminal, or humanly misunderstood, who invited us into knowledge and choice? The serpent in Eden was misunderstood on purpose. Hold that sentence. Let it sit like a stone dropped into a still pool. Look at the ripples it makes. We begin there because this is not merely a curiosity of old texts. It is a question about how authority shapes meaning, how symbols are weaponized or reclaimed, and how a single image, the curling, watching serpent, carries a freight of meanings across continents and ages. If the serpent was intentionally misread, why would anyone do that? And what would they gain by turning an awakener into a demon? Look with me first at the pattern outside of Genesis. Across ancient civilizations, the serpent is hardly a one-note figure. In Egypt, the uraeus, the rearing cobra worn on the brow of kings, signaled sovereignty and protection. It was not a marginal image, it was the royal diadem, a protective emissary standing between heaven and the human face. In the iconography of pharaohs, a serpent is an emblem of authority, a mediator of power. In Mesopotamia, we encounter figures like Ningishzida and serpentine motifs that entwine with staff-like emblems. The caduceus, familiar to us now as a symbol of medicine and healing, traces a complex lineage through Greek images of entwined serpents around a staff. Asclepius, the physician god, carries a rod with a single serpent, the sign of healing and restoration. In India, the image of the Kundalini, later named in technical texts, appears as a coiled energy, an inner fire laying latent at the base of the spine, rising the body's axis toward illumination. Whether we accept the later technical vocabularies or not, the cross-cultural persistence is striking. Serpent equals power, regeneration, a link between earth and sky. This is not to say every culture meant the same metaphysical program by that image. Symbols are fluid, but the repetition demands a question. Why, when so many traditions associate serpent form with sovereignty, healing, and awakening, does Genesis read the encounter in Eden, or at least the dominant reading that emerged in later Jewish and Christian traditions, as a fall from grace at the serpent's instigation? We are not starting from a place of accusing the biblical writers of incompetence. We begin by asking whether the later reception of that story did something intentional, whether interpretive communities reframed, rerouted, even criminalized a symbol that once stood for initiation. Before we race to conspiracy, we must ground ourselves in the text. Let us read Genesis closely, not to over-spiritualize what's not there, but to see what the language allows. Genesis shows us two trees and a garden.
Eden, in Hebrew, carries the sense of delight, of a place of relational abundance. The word often used in the Old Testament for delight, and the verb forms around it, invite an image of a state rather than solely a mapped place. The ancient Near Eastern imagination could hold both. Eden as a cultivated space, and Eden as a mode of being, a relational innocence where person and creation move without the reflections of self-other separation. The text's two central trees, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, function as poles in that drama, one oriented to sustained communion, the other to an awakening that distinguishes, judges, and chooses. Read with attention, Genesis 3 presents dialogue and consequence. The serpent speaks, the woman answers, and then there is action. Paraphrasing the moment, the serpent says to the woman that God knows that when she eats of the tree, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. The next verse says, then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. Later, God observes, behold, the man has become like one of us in knowing good and evil. Genesis 3:5, 3:7, 3:22, paraphrased from ESV. We have to note these textual facts plainly. The fruit brings a new faculty, discernment, self-awareness, and that faculty is described theologically as becoming like one of us. Whatever else Genesis intends, it links knowledge with likeness and an awakening with newly formed agency. This is the hinge. The serpent promises opening. The fruit produces opening. The text does not spell out the serpent's cosmological identity in a single line. Later interpreters filled the void. Some of that filling is the work of theology, some is the work of institutional imagination, but the gap invites multiple readings. One reading, the one familiar to most believers, is that the serpent is an adversary, a liar, a corrupter, that listening to it leads to disobedience and hence exile. Another reading, which I ask you to consider as a working hypothesis, is that the serpent functions as an awakener, a boundary crosser who points towards consciousness and choice at the cost of innocence. Both readings fit elements of the text. Both explanations are interpretive moves. We will live with this tension. We will press it. To deepen the puzzle, the biblical canon itself contains a surprising rehabilitation of the serpent motif. Consider Numbers 21. The Israelites complain, serpents appear, and people are bitten. The remedy God prescribes to Moses is striking. Make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole, and everyone who is bitten, when he sees it, shall live. Numbers 21:8 ESV. The image is explicit. To look at the raised serpent is to be healed. The symbol of the bite is countered by the very same serpentine form raised as an instrument of life-giving sight.
It is critical to treat this moment as textually canonical evidence that the authors were, at least at points, comfortable with serpent imagery being associated with deliverance. That is not a small detail. It means our reading of Eden cannot simply consign the serpent to absolute reptilian evil without contending with other traditions within the scriptures that deploy the image for restoration. If the bronze serpent in the desert is a remedial sign, if Israel's salvation in that episode depends on looking towards a pole-crowned serpent, then we must ask, how does this relate to the figure Jesus invokes in the Gospel of John? Jesus himself, narratively, draws a line to the Moses-raising moment. In John 3:14-15, he says, "And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life." The syntax is unambiguous. Jesus links his destiny, being lifted up, to the serpent on a pole motif. John 12 expands the imagery elsewhere when Jesus says, "And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself." John 12:32 ESV. The gospel writer and Jesus together establish a typology. The lifted thing heals and draws. The raised object becomes a focal point for grace. Pause with me over the audacity of that move. If the bronze serpent, an image that in Numbers functioned as an instrument of healing, points forward to the cruciform lifting of the Son of Man, then what are we to make of the serpent form in Eden? What is the chain of meaning that ties Eden, wilderness pole, and cross together? Is someone in the biblical narrative weaving a theme of ascent and healing through serpent imagery, or are we imposing a pattern because the images are similar? These are exegetical questions, not conspiratorial assertions. We must treat them with the caveats of scholarship: grammar, genre, tradition history, later theological overlays. But the textual links are clear enough to require interpretation. John 3's Moses reference is not an incidental poetic flourish. It is a hermeneutical key. Jesus is decoding Scripture by reorienting the serpent pole into the salvific axis of his being. Whether one reads that axis as primarily external, the historical pros, or as also emblematic of an inward spiritual ascent, John's point is that the raised sign mediates life. Here is where the misunderstood on purpose claim begins to take shape as a working thesis. If scriptural tradition itself sometimes redeploys serpent symbolism toward healing, why did later interpretive communities insist on a simplification that turned the serpent into a one-dimensional villain? Why would a symbol so evidently ambivalent be forced into a polemical role? We must be careful. To say on purpose is provocative. It risks sounding like a paranoid thesis.
So we will do what responsible interpreters must do: offer reasons, not accusations, and differentiate between what is likely, what is possible, and what is speculative. Several forces could produce systematic misreading. First, theological consolidation. As religious structures develop, they need clear moral outlines. A simple black and white narrative, obedience equals blessing, disobedience equals curse, serves pedagogical and social ends. It produces an easily teachable map for communities that need coherence in law, ritual, and identity. An ambiguous symbol like the serpent, embodying both danger and initiation, complicates moral catechesis. Simplifying it into an enemy clarifies protocol and preserves institutional authority. Second, polemical need. As Israel and later Christian groups distinguished themselves from surrounding pagan cults, they often reinterpreted common symbols defensively. If serpent motifs in neighboring cultures signified royal or sacred power, a redefinition that marks the serpent as deceptive helps demarcate identity. Cultural differentiation sometimes translates into demonization of the other symbols. Third, pastoral anxiety. Symbols that invite awakening, initiation, or the kind of inward autonomy associated with knowing can threaten hierarchical religious structures. If spiritual maturity is recast as interior sovereignty, where the soul is called to perceive and choose, then leadership loses monopoly on spiritual access. Institutional suspicion of individual experiential claims can lead to a theological architecture that privileges mediated, controlled sacraments over direct interior awakening. In such a context, a serpent that opens the eyes becomes a threat. These dynamics are plausible without asserting a global cabal. They are historical, sociological forces: consolidation, demarcation, and pastoral control. Each offers a pathway by which an ambivalent symbol could be read single-dimensionally. It is a hypothesis about motive, not a verdict about individuals. There is another layer to this: language. The Hebrew word often translated for serpent is nachash. The root field of nachash contains complications. It carries ideas of watching, shining, divination in some cognate uses, and to hiss in others. Some rabbinic and later traditions play with the ambiguities, sometimes making the creature into a clairvoyant being, sometimes into a cursed reptile. Linguistic slippage creates theological space. When a word hovers between watcher, oracle, and hisser, then communities must decide a single meaning to stabilize doctrine. Often they choose the meaning that best secures moral boundaries. And yet the Genesis narrative itself refuses a simple moralization. The serpent's speech is shrewd. The woman's reply is not naive. The immediate effect of the act is knowledge, shame, and exile. The human story moves from communion to separation. Any reading that seeks to romanticize the serpent into a purely benevolent teacher must nonetheless account for the real cost the text documents: alienation from God, the birth of moral calculus, and life shaped by toil and mortality. There is an initiation there, but not without its scars. That paradox is central to why the serpent becomes a contested figure. Initiation, by definition, disrupts innocence. To awaken is to be made capable of both good and evil, a double-edged coming into being. The ancients were not naive about initiation's cost. Mysteries of transformation often involve loss. The hero's journey requires descent before ascent. It would be a mistake to collapse the Genesis arc into pure triumphalism about awakening. The biblical story preserves both the gift and the wound. So where do we stand now? We have seen that the serpent as image moves across cultures as an emblem of power and healing. We have read Genesis as a narrative that links knowledge with likeness to the divine and marks the cost of that knowledge. We have noted Numbers' surprising use of the raised serpent as a remedy, and we have observed Jesus' self-identification with that schema in John. The contour of a different hermeneutic begins to emerge, one in which serpentine imagery is not merely evil, but is tied to an axis, a pole or spine, around which life, healing, and divine relation are mediated. At this juncture, pause and feel that question. If Jesus deliberately invoked the raised serpent, was he not, in a radical move, reinterpreting a fraught symbol and reclaiming it as a sign of life? Does his identification with that lifting suggest that the power the serpent figures is not inherently demonic, but can be transfigured and made salvific? Again, this is a reading. It is an interpretive path that reads the canon's internal intertextuality and notices patterns across genres. It is not a proof that the serpent of Eden was a saint. It is an invitation to think differently. Perhaps some of the interpretive energy that later demonized the symbol had motives we can discern: social, theological, protective, and perhaps some of that demonization was intentional in the sense of serving institutional aims. If you are following this, here is a small practical request. If this perspective lands with you, if the thought that a core symbol may have been systematically reframed resonates, then tap like and subscribe. Those gestures are not vanity metrics. They help these ideas circulate among others who are asking similar questions. We will get to deeper resources and a place where those wanting to explore further can gather. But for now, if this is striking you, show that you want the conversation to continue. Returning to the thread, the pattern we are tracing now becomes more embodied. Consider the pole. Moses elevates a bronze serpent on a staff. Jesus is lifted on a tree and claims the lifted posture.
Artists and mystics through the ages have echoed that vertical axis with their own symbols: staffs, rods, pillars, columns. In later mystical systems, Jewish, Christian, and beyond, that verticality is read as the axis between heaven and earth inside the human body. The spine becomes a map, the pole becomes a microcosm. Here we must pause and be careful. When I say spine and axis, I am not instructing anyone to practice techniques. I am saying that across a range of symbolic languages, The human verticality, a column or pole rising through the center, becomes a way to speak about transformation. The Kabbalistic tree of life maps Sephirot along a central pillar. Christian mystics described ascent toward union through interior stages. Hindu and later yogic metaphors speak of energy rising along an axis. These correspondences do not prove identity across traditions. They do, however, suggest a perennial symbolic architecture, a way humans have persisted in naming the movement from lower to higher, from unconscious to conscious, from bondage to freedom. If the serpent is associated with that movement in multiple registers, then the Eden encounter might be read as a primordial description of humanity's entry into the problem of autonomy, the opening of the eyes that makes us responsible. The later liftings, bronze in the desert, the Son of Man on the tree, become stages along the same axis, each translating the motif into historical or salvific language appropriate to its context. This is where the interpretive stakes rise. If the serpent is an awakener, then the Christian claim that Jesus reconfigures and heals that awakening is intoxicatingly powerful. He is both the human who becomes fully alive and the pole that transfigures the image into a sacrificial sign of life. The scandal is that a symbol many repressed as dangerous may have been the very shape of the path inward. The institutional impulse to securitize meaning would then look less like doctrinal purity and more like social preservation. But before we move further into the existential anatomy of these claims, we must not leave unexamined one critical counterpoint: the danger of idolizing inner experience at the expense of communal responsibility. One reason religious authorities may have dampened a certain kind of interiorist reading is not only power preservation, but concern for communal stability. An unchecked valorization of individual illumination can produce elitism, pride, and spiritual bypassing. Interpretations that emphasize inner awakening must therefore be tempered with ethics. The fruit of knowledge is not merely knowledge, it is loving relation. The biblical story insists that knowledge without relational wisdom brings shame and exile.
We hold that tension: the serpent as awakener, the fruit's cost, the raised pole as healing, Jesus' reconfiguration, institutional factors that may have solidified a demonized reading, and the ethical caution that inner insight must be yoked to humility and love. At this point in our investigation, the road forks. One path leads into comparative symbol work, archaeology, and the long history of cultic images, a deepening of the cross-cultural survey. The other path moves inward. How might these images be mirrored in the human body and spiritual anatomy? Both are necessary for the larger claim that the serpent in Eden was misunderstood on purpose to be persuasive. We have prepared the textual and cultural groundwork. The next move is to press the internal correspondence and to trace how Christian and pre-Christian mystics read the spine and pole as the theater of ascent, and to consider why institutional theology often transposed that theater into moral theater instead. We will pursue that in the next segment, examining ancient seals and iconography more closely, tracing the linguistic field around Nakash, and opening the gospel typology into a fuller account of how Jesus' lifting reframes what it means to be healed, not as a mere physical remediation, but as a reorientation of human sight and desire. We will also look, with cautious curiosity, at early Jewish mystical materials and how they negotiate the serpent motif, and at patristic responses that may have hardened reading over time. For now, carry the question forward: was the serpent misunderstood on purpose, or was our misunderstanding itself an accretion of fear, pedagogy, and political necessity? The answer will not be neat. It will be contested, layered, and, if honest, unsettling. Yet the inquiry itself is an act of remembering, to recover lines of meaning that once connected earth and heaven through a central axis, to interrogate why those lines were interrupted, and to ask whether Jesus' own rereading points us back toward a reconciled path. Now let us turn from the map to the artifacts, the seals, reliefs, and coins that carry the image of the serpent across time, and listen to what their shaped silence suggests. Object by object, we begin to hear a pattern. Serpents are placed on crowns, wrapped around staffs, coiled at thresholds. An Egyptian pharaoh wears the uraeus on his brow not as a decorative flourish, but as a sign that a living principle watches and mediates between sky and throne. Mesopotamian cylinder seals show serpentine figures alongside underworld and vegetation motifs. The serpent is not merely danger there, it is boundary and passage.
Greek sanctuaries of Asclepius feature the rod and serpent as the sign of healing. These are not incidental resemblances. They are recurring visual arguments about what a serpent can mean. Archaeology does not, by itself, prove a theological point, but it does complicate a straightforward moral reading.
When the visual world around early Israel and the nascent church is full of serpent figures associated with protection, wisdom, and restoration, a hermeneutic that reduces the serpent to simple malice stands in tension with the cultural grammar of the Near East and Mediterranean. That tension is a fact that interpreters must account for. Language deepens the puzzle. We already spoke of nachash, the Hebrew root often translated to hiss or serpent. But notice how related lexical fields carry the odious meanings of watching, shining, and divination in Semitic linguistics and cognate languages. In other ancient Near Eastern usage, the image of something that shines or watches is not automatically demonic. The root ambiguity creates room for divergent traditions. One current turns the figure into a trickster and adversary. Another preserves the image as a figure of mediating wisdom, even of life. If we widen our gaze to early Jewish interpretive traditions, we find evidence that some readers did not accept a single settled identity for the serpent. In the rich, variegated world of ancient Judaism, legal, prophetic, apocalyptic, and mystical, voices sometimes play with the serpent's identity in ways that resist simple moralization. Meanwhile, other strands, especially as theological systems consolidate, tend to fix a moral polarity, the serpent as emblem of the tempter, associated with the adversary who stands against God's order. Both exist in the textual ecosystem. Both are historically legible. A complementary and decisive hinge in our argument is iconography that links a vertical instrument, pole, staff, tree, cross, with a serpentine image. Why a pole? Why a rod? Symbols function by analogy. A raised pole becomes a visible center, a place to look, a focal point for attention. Moses is told to make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole. Those who look, live. Jesus says, in effect, just as that was raised, so I must be raised, and the cruciform raising becomes the locus through which life is mediated. The vertical pole, whether bronze in the desert or wood on Golgotha, answers to the human sense that the axis between earth and sky must be marked. The pole, in symbolic language, is the world thread, the world wrought. It is the place humans orient toward when they need to see differently. Now move from external artifacts to interior maps. Across traditions, people have described an interior pillar, a spine, an axis, along which transformation occurs. Jewish mystics mapped the Sephirot on a tree of life with a central pillar. Christian mystics spoke of ascent through stages toward union. Indian traditions later named a coiled energy at the base of the spine that rises in stages. Call it by whatever vocabulary you prefer: Sephirotic pillar, Kundalini coil, axis mundi within. The metaphor is persistent. Transformation moves along a middle line that connects lower and higher, earth and heaven, sensation and illumination.
This is the place where our readings coalesce into a coherent postulate. The serpent, placed on or beside that axis, signifies a movement of binding force that can either constrict or liberate. It can poison or mediate healing. That ambivalence is not failure, it is the essential character of initiation. Initiation opens the eyes. An opened eyes sees both beauty and danger. It sees opportunity and responsibility. The biblical narrative captures that dialectic perfectly. The fruit opens the eyes, and with opened eyes come shame, labor, and mortality, and also moral agency, relational complexity, and the capacity to make choices that bear consequence. What does Jesus do with this ambivalent motif? He refers back to Moses and then embodies the raised sign in his own life and death. That typological move is hermeneutically significant. Jesus re-signifies the raised instrument of attention, the lifted thing, as the means by which life is given. In one register, this is a political and soteriological claim. The cross is the locus of reconciliation and the consummation of God's way to heal the alienation human beings introduced. In another register, and this is a reading consistent with the typology without denying the historical event, the lifting points to an inner mechanism of transfiguration. The axis is made not merely visible in a historical act, but available as the pattern for human reorientation. Before we press further into the contemplative mapping, we must register an ethical and hermeneutical caution. The same images that can heal can also be idolized.
Early Christian writers were rightly wary of readings that prioritized ecstatic assent without ethical registration. Dogmatic consolidation had, among its purposes, a guarding function to ensure that experience did not outrun accountability. Pastoral concern and ecclesial order do not all equate to conspiratorial suppression. They are also responses aimed at preserving communal flourishing. Where institutional systems hardened certain readings, there may have been motives of control, but there were also motives of caution, prudence, and theological boundary setting. We must hold both realities in tension. With that caveat in place, let us look at some historical moments where the ambivalence became sharper. In the patriarchal era, several influential voices cast the Edenic serpent in satanic terms. The serpent's voice was equated with the seducing other, and exegesis from Augustine and other influential interpreters emphasized disobedience and original sin as explanatory kernels of human condition. That interpretive trajectory shaped Western Christian theology decisively. At the same time, marginal voices, including those whose writings were eventually sidelined, suppressed, or simply neglected, preserved alternative liturgical and mystical uses of similar symbols.
The history of ideas often flows from center to margin and back again. An image's sanctity in one community can easily become a symbol of heresy in another. Alongside these internal Christian debates, the encounter with surrounding cultures mattered. As Christianity delineated itself against Greco-Roman paganism, the symbolic economy of serpents, once shared, was sometimes recast as foreign and dangerous. Distinguishing identity can harden into rejection. That historical pattern explains why, in many Christian contexts, the serpent's more ambivalent or positive meanings faded from teaching and devotional life. Again, plausible social explanation, not necessarily a coordinated plot. Now consider early mystical and apocalyptic texts that persisted. They often speak in images that map onto our axis. Merkava mysticism imagines an ascent to divine chariots. Later Jewish Kabbalistic texts model inner channels and lights. Christian mystics map stages of purification, illumination, and union. These are not occult manuals in the modern sense. They are spiritual theologies, often cautious about practical details and heavy with ethical admonition. When read as a corpus, they show an older continuity of symbolic architecture that has been intermittently explicit and intermittently muted in mainstream teaching. It is here that the question in our title returns with force. Was the serpent misunderstood on purpose? We must nuance the phrase. On purpose can connote malevolence or simple social selection. Interpretive communities regularly choose clarity over ambiguity. That selection is purposeful in the sense of being decisive, not necessarily conspiratorial in the sense of malevolent secrecy. Clear motives can include the need to form a people, preserve orthodoxy, or protect the vulnerable from spurious claims of inward revelation. At the same time, there were costs to such decisive moves: loss of certain symbolic riches, narrowing of imaginal vocabularies, and a theological grammar that sometimes erased the idea that God might work through unexpected or dangerous-seeming images. When we frame the reinterpretation as partly intentional, we are naming a perennial human dynamic. Institutions consolidate meaning in ways that favor survival. That is not a scandal per se, it is anthropological description. But it does mean that symbols can be repurposed to suit social ends, and those repurposings shape spiritual imagination for generations. Recognizing that fact gives us a hermeneutical freedom. We can re-examine our inherited map without abandoning the core commitments that sustain healthy religious life. What then is practical for someone hearing this and wanting to take the insight responsibly into life? First, reclaim the question internally before acting externally. The discovery that a symbol may have been reframed invites a quiet inward work, a practice of discernment that resists both naive romanticization of the serpent and knee-jerk rejection. Discernment attends to three registers: text, what do our scriptures say and permit; tradition, what have the faithful across ages practiced and warned about; and interior fruit, what does this teaching produce in one's life: humility, love, and service, or pride, isolation, and self-aggrandizement. Any healthy reappropriation of a symbol must be accountable to those three dimensions. Second, tend to embodied ethics rather than secret techniques. The path of transformation the scriptures depict is not a set of tricks to be learned, but a lifelong reorientation of desire. Jesus claimed that he is the way, paraphrased, ties the means to a person, not to a method.
That person-centered orientation changes everything. The axis is not an occult lever to be pulled. It is a relationship in which one learns to see through Christic sight, where seeing rightly becomes loving rightly. The pole, then, is not simply a mechanism, it is a pointer to Christ as mediator of true integration. Third, engage communal practices that cultivate attention and responsibility. Recovery of interior language is not an individualistic pursuit. It belongs inside nourishing communities that hold one another accountable. The Apostle Paul's metaphor that the body is God's temple, paraphrase of 1 Corinthians 3:16, is not only metaphysical grammar, it is a social ethic. Our inner transformations matter because they shape how we embody love for others. Reclaiming symbolic resources should therefore be tethered to communal service, humility, and sacrificial care. Finally, maintain humility about the historical claims. To say that the serpent was misunderstood on purpose is to offer a working thesis, not a verdict. It is an invitation to scholarship, prayerful study, and a cautious interior experiment in seeing. We can and should read across disciplines, phonetics and lexemes in Hebrew, iconography from Egypt and Mesopotamia, patristic exegesis, and mystical texts. But we must also accept that some questions will remain sulcus deep, layered, contested, and fruitful precisely because they resist finality. Before we close, let us imagine again the sequence we traced. The garden where eyes are opened, the desert where a bronze serpent is lifted and people live when they look, the cross where the Son of Man is lifted and draws living toward himself. Read as a line, not a proof, but as a revealing pattern, these episodes suggest that attention, the act of looking, is not neutral. What we are invited to see changes what happens to us. In the bronze rod moment, the look mediates life. In the cruciform moment, the look is transfigured into faith in a person who will reorient desire. In Genesis, the awakening itself introduces responsibility. Taken together, the texts suggest recurring motifs: ascent through a central axis, the ambiguous role of the serpent, and the necessity of integrating knowledge with love. So, what would a faithful response look like in the present?
Begin with study. Read Genesis not as a closed courtroom document condemning curiosity, but as a layered narrative that names both gift and loss. Read Numbers and John side by side, noticing typologies without collapsing them into a single literal scheme. Listen to the ancient images. Do not worship them, but learn how our ancestors used them to speak about thresholds. Allow the Kabbalistic tree and Christian mystics and Hindu images to speak as comparative metaphors. They can illuminate the human experience without replacing covenantal faith. At the same time, do not treat this recovery as a license for secret techniques or sensational claims. Reclaiming a symbol is a theological and spiritual rehabilitation, not an operational manual. The ethical center must remain. Does this reclamation lead to increased love, service, humility, and communal flourishing? If it does, it is likely to have faithfulness about it. If it breeds isolation, superiority, or escapism, reject it. And then, finally, a pastoral encouragement. The recovery we are describing is less about clever reinterpretation and more about remembering. Jesus' repeated point that the kingdom is near, that the inner sight matters, and that he is the way toward communion, these are calls to remember who we are. The serpent, if it was indeed misunderstood or recast for institutional reasons, becomes in this reading not a model to be worshipped, but a symbol to be reconsidered, an image that can point us back to the real axis, to the person who makes the ascent to life possible without leaving us to the vanity of prideful autonomy. If you have felt this thought land in you, that an ancient image might have been reframed and that there is something to recover, there is a next step. For those who want to study with care, to sit with texts, to join a community that values both critical scholarship and humble interior practice, we have resources. A curated set of readings, visual plates of ancient iconography, and a modest conversation group where we trace these threads together with pastoral oversight. You'll find the links to the sacred scrolls and the community in the description and the pinned comment. They are offered as invitations, not directives. Explore them only insofar as they aid humility, charity, and grounded discipleship. Return one last time, inwardly, to the title that began this inquiry and has guided our steps. The serpent in Eden was misunderstood on purpose. Say it slowly, and let it be a question more than an accusation. Was it misunderstood on purpose? Possibly, in the sense that communities have repeatedly reinterpreted symbols for social, theological, and pastoral reasons.
Was it misunderstood in a way that robbed us of a truthful resource for transformation? Perhaps. But more importantly, can we now, with humility and mutual accountability, recover what is life-giving in the symbol without repeating earlier errors? That is the task before us.
May this line of thought lead you to careful study, to compassionate community, and to a humble interior asking that seeks not mastery, but communion. May the axis be for you a path of sight reoriented toward love, and may the memory of Christ, who was lifted to draw all people near, be the hermeneutic that governs all recoveries. If this conversation stirred something in you, take what you will in prayerful study. Let your practice be one of patient, faithful integration. Find the resources and the community link in the description and pinned comment if you feel called to explore further. Go gently, stay curious, and remember, the kingdom, in the deepest sense, is within. The serpent in Eden was misunderstood on purpose, and that misunderstanding itself can become a door through which new, reconciled sight comes into being. Blessings on your way.